Okay, this is a brief review on fractions. So we're going to use fractions without a calculator throughout the year here. So you want to make sure you're very familiar with what to do when you have to multiply and divide fractions and add and subtract fractions. So when multiplying and dividing fractions, these are a little bit easier. It's actually easier to do this than it is to add and subtract because you don't need to have a common denominator. When you multiply fractions, you literally just multiply going across. So you multiply your numerators and you multiply your denominators. Okay, so in this case we would have 3 times 2, which gives me 6, over 5 times 3, which gives me 15. Now this fraction can be simplified, right? 3 divides both 6 and 15, so I would write that now as 2/5. Now another way to do this problem without actually having to simplify at the end is to simplify before you actually multiply across. So what we look for are common factors here, and since 3 and 3 both are divided by 3, we would divide both of these terms by 3. This would cancel. This would cancel also, leaving me with 1. So when I multiply across now, I end up with 1 times 2, which gives me 2, and 5 times 1, which gives me 5. So I get the exact same answer here without having to simplify at the very end. Okay, now when you divide, dividing fractions, hopefully everybody knows what it means to multiply by the reciprocal. So I take this number, 5/8, I don't change this at all. However, I change this division into a multiplication, and I now make that 6 over 25. So I multiply by the reciprocal here. Now in this case, it's probably going to be a lot easier for you instead of just multiplying across. So you still use the same rules now that we did over here. We'd multiply across, we'd get 30. Multiplying on the bottom, we'd get 200. Now you can simplify this one probably pretty easily because the zeros are going to cancel, leaving you with 3/20. But let's say you got some bigger numbers here and you're not quite sure how to simplify it. You could have avoided having to simplify if you had from the start looked for common factors to cancel out. So let's look at 5 and 25. So they have to be on opposite sides, numerators to denominators. You can't look at numerator to numerator. So you can't look at these two and try to cancel these out. You can only look at numerator to denominator. So 5 goes into 5, it also goes into 25. So if I simplify this, I can make that 1. And if I divide 25 by 5, I get 5. So I just made the problem a little bit easier because now I'm not multiplying by a much larger number. Now with 6 and 8, I'm also going to look for a common factor between 6 and 8. That number would be 2. So 6 and 8 are both divisible by 2. So if I divide that by 2, I get 3. If I divide this by 2, I get 4. Now I end up with the resulting problem that looks like this. So it's much easier if I multiply across, I get 3/20. Again, I've avoided having to simplify at the very end. Okay? Right now, when you add and subtract fractions, now you must have a common denominator. You cannot add and subtract fractions without having a common denominator. So in this case, really important, really important to remember this. So you don't need it for multiplying and dividing, which is why they're easier, but for adding and subtracting fractions, you must have a common denominator. So in this case, I would use a common denominator here of 15. So in order to change this denominator in the first fraction of 15, I actually have to multiply by 3, right? Well, I just changed the number if I multiply just by 3 on the bottom of the denominator, so I'm going to multiply the numerator as well by 3 because multiplying by 3 over 3 is like multiplying by 1. I'm not really changing the number, I'm just rewriting it in a different way. So now the numerator becomes 9. So I have 9/15 plus, and now over here I'm going to multiply again in the denominator to get the same denominator 15. And this time I choose the number 5, so this now becomes 3 times 5, 15. And on top I must make sure I multiply also by the same number, so I get 10/15. Now when I simplify, I end up with 19/15. So when you add fractions or when you subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. Once you find that common denominator, you only add or subtract the numerator. So in this case, 9 plus 10 changes to 19, and notice that 15 and 15 does not become 30. So that's a really common mistake, so make sure you don't do that. You keep the same denominator. Alright, now the second question I have here has a mixed number. Before you can even add or subtract here, you need to make sure you change this mixed number into an improper fraction. In order to do that, so we take 1 and 3/5 here, you multiply the whole number and your denominator, that would give me the number 5, and then you add this a numerator, which is going to give me 8. So 1 3/5 is equivalent to 8/5. Again, I multiply 1 times 5, and then I add the 3's to get me 8/5. So now I have 8/5 minus 3/4. Again, I need a common denominator here. My common denominator in this case, I'm going to choose the number 20. In order to make this 5 into a 20, I have to multiply by 4, which means I have to now multiply the numerator by 4, so that I'm only changing it by a factor of 1, which isn't really changing the number at all. So I multiply 4 and 8, and I get 32. Over here, I'm going to do the same thing. This time I'm going to multiply by the number 5, though, in order to get 20. So I multiply by 5 on the denominator as well as the numerator, so I get 15. Now the operation here is to subtract. So again, I just do the tops, the numerators here. 32 minus 15 is 17, and the denominator stays the same, so 17/20. Now, I'm just going to do one extra problem here that I didn't have on before. Sometimes you might be asked to do some crazy problems. I'm just kind of making up numbers off the top of my head here and just writing them in. This isn't that tough, but let's see, 12 times 3/8 times, let's do 4/5. Okay. So on a problem like this, let's say you get this problem and you're not allowed to use a calculator. Now, don't freak out, because you can use our rule about canceling cross factors. So what you're going to look for are numbers where you can start canceling away. Like for example, this 2, well, you could cancel out the 4. Actually, this is kind of bad. I gave you a fraction that can be simplified. So actually, let's just go ahead and simplify it. So let's make that 1/2. Now, let's go over the 3. Are there any numbers in the denominator that you can choose to cancel and that are divisible by 3? If you look, 2 is not divisible, 5 is not divisible, 8 is not divisible. Once you get to 12, though, these both have a common factor of 3. So if I divide out the 3 here, I left with a 1 here, a 4 here, okay? And now I just made the problem a little bit easier for myself. So I keep moving along and doing the same thing. Now, you can also start from the denominator and look for common, or something that has a factor of 2 as well in the numerator. So let's look at 2 now. As I go across, I see the number 6. So I'm going to cancel this out, because 2 goes into 2 one time, and 2 goes into 6 3 times. So now again, I've just made the problem a little bit easier for myself. Now I go across, and I look at this 5 here. I happen to have a 5 in the numerator. These are going to cancel out completely. So now, if you just rewrite, this whole fraction has become 1. This whole fraction here has become 1. So I have 1 times 1. And then I have this 3/8. I'm just trying to simplify it. Keep going. This fraction has become 1/4. This fraction here remain untouched. It's still 3/8, and now I still have 4/5. So we start again, and we start looking for cross-canceling. I notice that I have a 4 and a 4 here. Okay, and it looks like right now I don't have anything else that I can cancel out, because 3 does not fit into 8, 8 doesn't fit into 3, 3 doesn't fit into 5. So I'm now going to just multiply across, and this has become a pretty basic question for me. 3 times 3 is 9. 8 times 8 times 5. So this is a little bit larger. So let's do 8 times 8, which is 64. And then you can show the work off to the side. So sometimes this is reasonable for us to ask you to do this, because this is only 2 digits multiplied by a single digit. Sometimes you might get 2 digits times 2 digits, which is still something that you should be able to do. But again, we just made this problem much easier for ourselves. So multiplying double digit by single digit here, we're going to multiply by 4 times 5, we get 20, so we add 2. Multiply 6 times 5, you get 30, add the 2, so that's 320. So we get 9/320 when we started off with a much scarier looking problem. Okay, that's the end of simplifying and adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions.